Welcome to episode 8 of Nihon no購入品紹介. In this episode, we're going to dive into the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance was released in 2001 in March in Japan, and in North America just a few months later in June, and it's the successor to the Game Boy Color. It was a good next step for handhelds. It had updated graphics, it had new cartridges that are a little different from the Game Boy Color cartridges. This is a Game Boy Color cartridge, and then Game Boy Advance cartridges were a little slimmed down. And they're not region locked either, so you can play Game Boy Advance games from any region. And it's sideways compared to the upright Game Boy Color and Game Boy, so it's a little different to be holding it sideways, or what feels like sideways, as opposed to the Game Boy and Game Boy Color predecessors. So, like I said, it's got different cartridges, but it's still backwards compatible with Game Boy Color cartridges, so you can play Game Boy and Game Boy Color cartridges, and there's also some abilities to communicate with a GameCube through the Game Boy player and link cables, and it just had good updated capabilities. It did receive a model upgrade in 2003 in the form of the Game Boy Advance SP, where it has this clamshell opening, and then it would receive another revision in 2005 after the Nintendo DS, the successor, released, and that had a better screen. And to this point, that Game Boy Advance screen was the best screen that any Game Boy had ever had to that point. Obviously, we would then get to the DS, which had different screens, but that last revision of the Game Boy Advance had the best screen of any Game Boy. So it's an overall pretty good system. It sold over 80 million units, so it didn't totally sell like hotcakes, but it still sold really well. And I have just a few different models, but this Game Boy Advance is not the exact one I had when I was growing up, but it's the same color as the one I had growing up. So it's definitely the most nostalgic for any system I have at all. I would probably call it my favorite game system of all time, which might be a stretch, but I have very fond memories of playing my Game Boy Advance and the SP that I would end up getting at one point. So that's pretty good. A lot of the games in this episode, it's kind of interesting. I will either say a lot about, or I will say next to nothing. The games were really obscure to research, so either I found a lot or I found nothing. So we'll get right into the games. The first game we're going to talk about is Densetsu No Stafy 2, or the legendary Starfy 2. So this is a 2003 platformer developed by TOSE and published by Nintendo, and it's the second game in the legendary Starfy franchise. So the one game that did come to North America was Starfy, but in Japan it stayed as Stafy without the R. So the franchise on its whole is about a platforming star literally named Stafy, and it was initially planned to be released for the Game Boy Color, but would end up getting pushed back and canceled in favor of a Game Boy Advance release. That would have been Densetsu No Stafy 1. This is Densetsu No Stafy 2, so that's a sequel to that game. The game was released almost exactly a year after the first release, this one specifically, and you play as Stafy as you help people around the land and ultimately aim to beat Ogura and his children. It's the longest game in the legendary Starfy series, with just over 100 total levels and multiple levels per area, kind of like Sonic. And the series had 4 GBA titles in total, which were all stuck in Japan. The most recent game came out all the way back on the DS in 2008. So we haven't had a Starfy game in several years. But the DS release is also the only one to have come to North America as the legendary Starfy. So that's kind of interesting, weird little, mostly stuck in Japan series. But how could you deny a cute star of his platforming? The next game is a great example of a game that I was not able to find a lot of info about, and that would be the Butsu Jima no Chobi Gurumi 2 Tamachan Monogatari, or what might be slimmed down to Animal Picnic. Not officially, just that's what some source said. This is a 2004 action game developed by AI and published by the Rocket Company, and it looks like you're a girl whose goal is to have a picnic, and there's some story or adventure behind getting that picnic. There's almost no gameplay or info about it whatsoever anywhere, but the chance to get a super cheap, complete in-box Japanese Game Boy Advance game was kind of too hard to pass up. So going along with all the other stuff that I bought, Just a good example of stuff nonetheless. So kind of cool nonetheless. Next game is Finding Nemo, Arata na Boken. So Finding Nemo is a 2003 Disney Pixar movie about a fish who gets kidnapped, and his single father travels basically across the entire ocean to go find him, which really tones down like the plot of the story. But I loved this movie growing up. I watched it not all that long ago, and it holds up really, really well. And on top of that, it's the earliest movie I can remember seeing in theaters. So I was just a few years old when Finding Nemo came out. It's probably not the first movie I saw in theaters, but it's the first one that I remember. So the first game in the series is just Finding Nemo, and that was released in 2003 for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and the Game Boy Advance. And that mostly follows the movie. This game is a 2004 puzzle adventure-ish game developed by Altron and published by THQ only for the Game Boy Advance. So original game released for a bunch of systems, but the sequel, this one, only released on the Game Boy Advance. So at the end of the movie, there's a post-credits scene where the tank gang, or the group of fish that help Nemo escape from the dentist office, they get freed from the dentist office and they end up in the ocean. So the game essentially follows that story that was never really fleshed out, and you play as each member going from the dentist office to the ocean. So it's kind of a cool way to tie in the movie to a game as a sequel-ish. This game was initially released in the US as Finding Nemo: The Continuing Adventures. Very straightforward title. And it would end up coming to Japan a few months later. So again, the uncommon case where we had a game that was initially released in the US, then brought to Japan. So pretty cool. Movie I love. Cool to get a game with a slightly weird history behind it. Next game is Fruits Mura no Dobutsu Tachi, or The Animals of Fruit Village. Let's Create a Lively Village. This is a 2004 minigame collection developed and published by TDK Core. And it seems, honestly, just like an Animal Crossing clone. Your goal is to make friends and build up a town. That's about all I could gather about the game. This didn't come to North America, but it did also have a DS sequel only in Japan in 2006. So not much I can say about this game, but there were more games in the series, which is just kind of funny. So another cool piece. You could see the cases of either having a lot to say or not a lot to say for these games. But the next one is Futari wa Precure Arianai Yume no Kuni wa Daimekyu, or Futari wa Precure I Can't Believe This, The Dream Garden is a Huge Labyrinth. That's what all that translates to. So Pretty Cure is an anime franchise that began in 2004 about magical teenage girls who fight the forces of evil on Earth. There's almost 1,000 episodes of that anime, and it's spawned into manga for each season, movies, toys, games, another big Japanese media franchise. So this game is a 2004 puzzle platformer developed by Open Sesame and published by Bandai as a game loosely based on the anime. You play as two specific characters as they fight the evil king to return the power of dreams to the Garden of Dreams. And there's also unlockable mini-games, so there's quite a bit to do here. This was the very first of the Pretty Cure games, so the very first one. And it may appear again. Pretty Cure might appear again in a future episode. But we'll worry about that when we get there. But still cool to get another piece of, Japanese media lore, I guess. The next game is Granbo, which is a 2004 RPG developed and published by Capcom. And of all the games we have looked at so far in this series, this has to be the closest thing I have seen to a Pokemon clone. It's a turn-based monster catcher, and just to name a few of the similarities to Pokemon, here we go. The first one is that you catch, train, battle, and evolve animal-like robots called Granbo that are held in data balls, and you hold 6 of them at any given moment, which is also the maximum you can hold for Pokemon. The second one is that you pick one of 3 Granbo to begin the game, almost like picking one of your 3 starters. There's an overarching villainous team to battle against. Granbo are of fire, water, wood, and dark elements, so not nearly as many types as Pokemon, but they still have typing. And there's even status conditions that vary from Granbo to Granbo, which is kind of funny. Honestly, it looks like a modern Pokemon ROM hack, which is kind of cool, considering that it came out, over 20 years ago. But you have 3v3 battles, so it's as close to a Pokemon clone as we can get. This game specifically was also released on the Wii U Virtual Console only in Japan in 2016. It didn't come to North America at all, and I wasn't able to find a whole lot of information about it on the web elsewhere, but I did find a fantastic retrospective by Mary Bites on YouTube, so I will definitely be linking that in the document with all the sources and links. As always, all my sources and links will be in the description, so if you find a game that you are interested in or want to see the gameplay of, there should be a link for it in the description, so definitely go check that out. The next one is Kiss X Kiss Seirei Gakuen, or Kiss Kiss Government Ordnance School. So this is a 2004 strategy visual novel adventure game, ? Developed by Kamui and published by Bandai, apparently based on a girl's manga, but that's all I could find about it. I couldn't even find any information about the actual manga itself. It's not the same as a manga with a very similar title that when I asked a friend if she knew anything about potentially this series, she thought I said something else, and that something else was definitely very risque and too risque for me to talk about in a video. So just another game to get. A lot of these Game Boy Advance games are super duper cheap, so that's why they kind of all ended up in the cart. So kind of cool nonetheless, but we're just hoarding Game Boy Advance games at this point. The next one is a game I can actually say a little bit about. That would be Kotoba no Puzzle Mojipitan Advance, or Kotoba no Puzzle Letters Are Perfect Advance. So this is a 2003 puzzle game developed and published by Namco. Kotoba no Puzzle Mojipitan is basically a series of Scrabble games that began in arcades in 2001. This game again 2003. So Japanese Scrabble, that's what Kotoba no Puzzle is. The series never left Japan. There was a Wii game in 2008. There was also this game coming to the Wii U Virtual Console in 2015. And there was also another Kotoba no Puzzle game, the most recent one, released on modern systems in 2020. So there is a way to play them, just not here in North America. But there's also even a board game based on Kotoba no Puzzle released in 2007. So if you like Scrabble, you might like Scrabble in Japanese. Kind of cool. I remember getting the Wii game last summer, I believe. And so when I saw this game as one that was available, I was like, well, let me go pick that one up too, to kind of go along with the collection. The next one is a very weird one. I bought it because it had a very strange title that is not even close to what its actual title is, but its official title is Kurohige no Kurouto Gentori, which roughly translates to Blackbeard Takes Up His Position. This is a 2002 puzzle game developed by Happy Smile and published by Tomy, and it looks very, very confusing. The purpose of the game, or the goal of the game, is to control balls on a hexagonal chess-like board, and you rotate groups of balls where you try to change them to be your type. So obviously, if you take over the board, that's how you win. I wish I remember what the name of the game was when I bought it, because it was just really funny. Something to do with like pirate chess balls, something to that effect. So it was kind of funny. But nonetheless, they're pirates, and it's a silly little ball puzzle game. So just kind of funny to have. The next one is Mario vs. Donkey Kong, which is a 2004 puzzle platformer developed and published by Nintendo as a spiritual successor to the original Donkey Kong game, the one originally released in arcades as the birth of Jumpman, who would eventually become Mario. So this is the first true Mario against Donkey Kong game since that. And it kind of spawned its own little mini-series. So in this game, you play as Mario in levels with both puzzle and platforming elements, where your goal is to defeat Donkey Kong in a toy factory. The premise of the game is based on Donkey Kong getting mad when mini Mario toys sell out, which is kind of funny that you then have to defeat him. The game initially released in the US and then went to Japan a month later. There was a Japan-only 3DS Virtual Console release in 2011. In 2015, there was also a Japan-only Wii U Virtual Console release, and it would then come to North America in 2017 on the Wii U Virtual Console. So not a whole lot of ways to play this game. Like I said, it had a handful of sequels. The next game came out on DS, So if you've seen the game, maybe you've seen it on DS. But most recently and most interestingly, that there was in September in the Nintendo Direct, they announced a remake for this game for the Switch coming this February. So if you don't want to play it in its original form on Game Boy Advance or any of its sequels on DS, you could then go play it on the Switch this February. So that's pretty cool. But, Mario and Donkey Kong, how could I say no? The next game is a game we've talked about a couple times, the franchise we've talked about a couple times, most recently on the N64 with Puyo Puyo Sun. So that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about Puyo Puyo. We have Mina de Puyo Puyo, or literally it translates to Everybody Puyo Puyo, but it's better known as Puyo Pop here in North America. So the series is a series of puzzle games that are sufficiently different from Tetris, and they've been all over the place. The first game came out in 1991, and games just get ported to every system possible, it seems like. But it most recently started collecting steam here in North America because of two Switch titles, Puyo Puyo Tetris 1 and 2. So this is a 2001 puzzle game developed by the Sonic team, the first of which in the Puyo Puyo series to be developed by the Sonic team and published by Sega. So at some point, the Puyo Puyo games were acquired by Sega, and that's who they were published by. So this is the first Game Boy Advance Puyo game. It's the last, however, to use the original cast of characters that were originally found in a series called Mado Monogatari. And then after this game, they would have a new slate of characters to play as. So there's a pretty good amount of content in this game for a GBA title. There's a story mode, there's multiplayer modes. There's a card collecting gallery after you beat the game once, which is pretty cool in itself. The story revolves around the Dark Prince setting up a Puyo Puyo tournament, which seems like a pretty silly thing to do for somebody who goes by the title The Dark Prince. It was brought to North America a few months later in 2002 as Puyo Pop. At that time, it was published by THQ, and it was even ported to the N-Gage in 2003. So the N-Gage is by Nokia, which was a handheld that was meant to combat the Game Boy Advance. Naturally, it didn't do well, but it was supposed to be like a phone, like an early version of a phone. So like Nokia made phones. So an early version of a phone that's supposed to double as a game system. So kind of a weird piece of history, but this game ended up there, which is kind of funny. So another Puyo game, another cool one to add to the collection. The next one, we got to talk a little bit about a Famicom game before we talk about the Game Boy Advance game. So I have another game in this series. That would be Momotaro Densetsu Peach Boy Legend. So this is a new add to the collection that would have made it into a Famicom episode at some point. And it roughly translates to Legend of Momotaro Peach Boy Legend. So this is a 1987 RPG developed and published by Hudson as the first game in the Momotaro series. It's a video game series based on Japanese folklore, most namely Momotaro, which roughly translates to a hero born from a peach, which is why it's called Peach Boy Legend. So the game is a very typical JRPG, and you battle against different wizards. That's the purpose of the game. So just to name some of the wizards, because some of them are very funny. There's the Unicorn Wizard, the Flatulent Hermit Wizard, the Worthless Wizard, the Dreamy Dream Wizard, and the Hell Incarnate. So JRPG for sure. The main series is Momotaro Densetsu, but there's also a board game-like series under the same franchise called Momotaro Densetsu. And I have some of those games, actually, from collecting Japanese games last summer on the Super Famicom, which is kind of funny. But there are also some smaller lines of games in the Momotaro series. We might see one of them in just a second. But it also had an anime set in outer space. So not a huge Japanese media franchise, but one with sufficiently weird history anyway. The franchise never left Japan, but this game sold over 1 million copies, which is pretty successful for a game that almost nobody's heard of, at least here in North America. It did receive a port to the Sharp X68000, which was a home computer in Japan. It was about a year later it got that. There was also a re-release on PS1 in 1998. Couldn't find a whole lot of info about that, but there was some mention of that on a website. That was a source. The most recent title in the Momotaro series was released on 3DS, but it's been dormant since then. So definitely a interesting find for North American collectors. So this is the original game, the first game in the series. But the reason why we are in the Game Boy Advance episode is because we have Momotaro Matsuri, or Momotaro Festival, which was apparently its own line of games, but I think it's more likely that it was just a one-off game as the Momotaro Festival series. This is a 2001 RPG developed and published by Hudson as part of that spin-off series, according to Wikipedia, and it's just an RPG. So it's a spin-off, but it's still basically the same kind of idea. I had some of the games from collecting last summer, so I saw more Momotaro and just added it along. So kind of cool nonetheless. But in the first episode of this series, we talked about Galaxian and Galaga on the Famicom. So what we're going to talk about today is Famicom Mini Dig Dug. So Dig Dug is a 1982 arcade game developed and published by Namco, where you control the titular Dig Dug, where you defeat enemies on a stage, where you have to defeat all of the enemies on a stage to clear it, and you either make paths that drop rocks onto those enemies, or you have an air pump that inflates the enemies, and that's how you can defeat them. I realized I didn't quite know what was happening until I actually looked it up. I've played Dig Dug plenty of times before, but it sounded very, very silly when actually describing it, which is kind of funny. You basically play in dirt and you make paths through, and that sort of like clearing dirt, one of the reasons I liked Dig Dug so much was just because it seemed like ASMR clearing out the dirt to make paths. Never really knew what I was doing prior to then. I mean, now I do, but I would just play it in arcades just to like clear paths, and I thought that was the whole purpose, which is kind of funny for a little kid to do. I'm pretty terrible at the game anyway, but it's no big deal. That's not what we're here to talk about. The arcade game came to North America the same year, but published by Atari, and the arcade game here in North America was a huge success and proceeded to get ported everywhere. So the biggest one is on the Atari 2600. So we got Dig Dug there, but it was home computers too, other systems in the Atari 2600 generation, the Famicom in 1985, but there was no NES release to go along with it. There was also a release on the original Game Boy in 1992, but that also wasn't released in Japan, or not also released, but kind of flipped that it was on the Famicom in Japan, but not on the NES, and then kind of flipped that it was on North American Game Boys, but not on Japanese Game Boys. It was also released on eShops and Virtual Consoles, and that's not even to say anything of its inclusion on all the Namco Museums series, so all those releases, which is kind of cool. So if you want to play Dig Dug, there are ways to play it. This port specifically was released in 2004, only in Japan as part of the Famicom Mini line. So in North America, we got the classic NES series, which was just NES games ported to Game Boy Advance, since the hardware was strong enough to be able to do just that. But the equivalent of that in Japan was the Famicom Mini series. So NES here in North America, Famicom there in Japan. But the interesting thing is that we in North America only got 12 classic NES series titles. In Japan, though, there are more Famicom Mini exclusive titles than there are just North American classic NES series titles. So more exclusive to Japan, plus the ones that were also classic NES series. So there's a ton of these Famicom Mini cartridges in Japan, which is really, really cool. The series Dig Dug had more games and sequels, but none that saw anything close to the success of the first one. Most interestingly for me, I have a friend who is an even bigger Dig Dug fan, humongous Dig Dug fan, and if he's watching this, Duncan, this one's for you. So I liked Dig Dug, not as much as Duncan, but I do like Dig Dug. Cool to get a game in a classic NES series style. So still just pretty cool nonetheless. So that's all I have for this episode. Like I said, all my sources and all my links are going to be in the description if you want to find out more about it than the short little snippets that I gave you. I hope you learned something about these games. If I didn't get something right, or if I said something wrong, or if there's something I should have included, please correct me. Like I always say, I want to learn about these games just like I am hopefully teaching you something about them. And that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching, and see you next week.